Hi, and welcome to the 94th TiddlyWiki Hangout. I'm Jeremy Ruston, the inventor of TiddlyWiki, and I'm joined today by Mark. Mark, would you like to say hi, tell us your name, where you're from, and something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Hi, my name is Mark Robbins. I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada. I've been working with TiddlyWiki in a personal context for last year and a half, and trying to make it bright and shiny and wonderful to draw people's attention.
Indeed. Great that you could join us. Thank you, Mark. Nathan, would you like to say hello, introduce yourself, and tell us something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Yes, hi, I'm Nathan Kane. I'm a developer from the United States. I've been working with TiddlyWiki for a couple of years now. I've largely been away from it for a couple of months, but I'm kind of digging back into some things and dusting off some old projects and picking work back up.
Great to have you here. Thanks for joining us, Nathan. And Steve just joined us while I was doing the introductions. Hi, Steve. Would you like to introduce yourself, say where you're from, and something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Sure, I'm Steve Schneider. I'm a professor at SUNY Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York. I've been I use playing importantly, playing with TiddlyWiki for a long time, and in the process of developing a very exciting sort of open course where we'll be teaching TiddlyWiki technique and hypertextual theory in the spring, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk about that. Thanks.
Indeed. Steve was on the Hangout a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lot of very positive feedback on the group afterwards. So, in fact, just before you arrived, we'd elected to go down a fairly technical kind of path. But I think what we might do, Mark, if you don't mind, is first explore some of the less technical questions on our plate, and then perhaps return to that one. And I suggest that partly because the more code-oriented stuff, when the worst comes to the worst, we can discuss that on GitHub. Whereas I think it's the discussions that are on the kind of on the junction between the world of the technical, the domain of the technical, and the domain of the user that that seem to be so interesting. So perhaps I'll take the opportunity to just very quickly update you on what I've been working on in the last week in relation to TiddlyWiki, which I think has an impact on, is something that cropped up in my last conversation with Steve, and so perhaps we can go from there into some of the topics of interest to you, Steve. So the problem that I've been trying to solve, or that we've all been trying to solve for a while, is multi-dimensional. So there's aspects of it are that the Google Groups is not a universally popular way of running the TiddlyWiki community. One of the reasons for that is that it's Google Groups and not TiddlyWiki, and there's a kind of recurring background desire to be able to eat our own dog food and host our discussions on TiddlyWiki. We also have a recurring but slightly different issue cropping up, which is people wanting to contribute to the TiddlyWiki documentation, and an enormous barrier for them being the necessity of contributing through GitHub. And even if they engineer that, waiting for Jeremy to accept their change and for them to then see it go live. There's a bunch of these things that basically come down to the limitations that we get from the fact that the core TiddlyWiki project infrastructure is static. TiddlyWiki.com is a static website based on GitHub pages. Therefore, it doesn't have commenting. Therefore, it doesn't have any of the interactive features in the sense of being able to input data as well as to be able to obtain data from it. So there's been a lot of discussion about this, recurring topic in the Hangouts for years, I think. one of the arenas in which we discuss this is federation. It's the idea of being able to run services or communities that look something like our Google Groups community, but that don't have a single centralized control in the same way that Google Groups does. So what I've most recently, though, also another user need that has burst through to me is the need to set up an intranet. So in my day job, it would be useful to set up an intranet. And that means nowadays, now that companies don't have private networks, that means a TiddlyWiki hosted on the internet somewhere that can be authenticated against. In our case, it would be Google Apps. So Google Apps is the email provider, and you know how you can sign into services using your Gmail address. You can also sign into services using your custom email address that is managed by Google. So that if you've got a company called acme.com and Google's running your email, then you can authenticate your users using Google. So I wanted to be able to make an intranet for a closed group of users that allowed anybody to make updates. And it's not quite the same requirement as the ones that I listed that are around the TiddlyWiki community, but the technical problems that need to be solved are much the same. So over the last 2 or 3 months, I've been working with Amazon's APIs to explore how to implement what I call TiddlyWiki in the sky for Amazon, which is a really useless name, but some time ago I liked the idea of TiddlyWiki in the sky to distinguish TiddlyWiki running on a server side from TiddlyWiki in your pocket or in your desktop or on your laptop or something. And so this has been a process of me trying to understand the Amazon APIs and implementing them in the right way within TiddlyWiki to be able to do, to flexibly use a lot of Amazon features that particularly cover my use case, but also other related use cases. It turns out that the difficulty with all of that is when you log into Amazon Web Services, that they have dozens upon dozens of separate independent services. And this means that the hardest thing is actually just figuring out which service you need to use. So let me screen share to give you a brief taste of that. So this is my Amazon console, and that is the menu of all the AWS services. So I guess we're all used to this. When you start doing something new, you need to learn the vocabulary. But this is one of the worst examples because most of these words are sort of marketing speak that don't mean very much. Cognito means nothing because it's a meaningless word. Config is meaningless in this context because config is everything and everywhere. Anyway, after a while, one can make sense of these services, and there's 2 services that I'm focusing on at the moment. The first is S3, which is roughly a more sophisticated alternative to Google Pages. So it's a static file repository, and you can opt for the files in what's called an S3 bucket to be exposed to the internet. So it's a way of doing web hosting at its simplest. But within that, from applications perspective, it's where you store big blobs of data. And the interface to S3 is astonishingly simple. To Amazon's great credit, well, I don't know if it is Amazon's credit actually, but one of the consequences of the move to cloud that's a little unexpected is the opportunity to simplify what the developers use. So when you're running on your own machine, anyway. So look, here is docs.tiddlywiki.com. This is a bucket I created on Amazon. It's got an HTML file in it called hello.html. If I double click it, I think it'll, and if I download it, there we go, downloads the file rather laboriously. There it is. So it's an HTML file with a wiki link in it, actually, and the text of Alice in Wonderland. And the code necessary to do that, and there was me saying I won't make it very technical, but this is, hopefully, extremely non-technical. This is the code to put a file to S3. So as even the non-coders can see, there's 3 lines to it, and it would be trivial to simplify it even further. Basically, we say, oi, Amazon S3, I want to talk about this bucket, which is the name of the container for the files. And then we say we want to write something with a given key and a given body, which are the title and text fields. And then we call upload, and off it goes. Similarly, for the other service that I'm using extensively is DynamoDB. And DynamoDB is Amazon's NoSQL database. And basically, it's a very good fit for TiddlyWiki. That if you look at this sample table, when you define a table, you have to specify the index fields. So I think here somewhere there you can see primary key is title. Beyond title, you don't need to pre-declare any of the fields. So if I look at this entry, you can see, there you go, it's a, there's the text of the tiddler, and there is its title. And the code to write to a DynamoDB database is similarly ridiculously simple. We just round up each of the fields, and then it's a single call to put a record to the database. There's a bit more complexity to create tables and to wait for them to become available. Okay, so I'm emphasizing that because, you know, for me, getting to grips with Amazon is a bit of a learning curve, doing some new stuff. What I'm discovering on the other side of the learning curve is that things are amazingly simple, and AWS is extraordinarily well, you know, it's well documented by Amazon. There's an awful lot of other technical help out there to help you through it. So what this all gives, the short-term goal is to use another service called Amazon Lambda, which gives us the ability to run JavaScript fragments, event-driven JavaScript in the cloud. So basically you upload a fragment of JavaScript and you define what triggers it. So imagine this scenario. We have a TiddlyWiki file sitting in S3. Visitors have to authenticate, but then they retrieve that HTML file from S3. If they modify a tiddler, the sync process will try to write it back to the server, and it does that with an HTTP post. We intercept that HTTP post with a Lambda function, which stores the new tiddler value in the DynamoDB database, and also kicks off a, well, probably kicks off a queue to then kick off a process that rebuilds the HTML file from the underlying tiddlers. So what that rather laboriously explained workflow gives you that's pretty cool is all visitors to the site, they get a statically served HTML file. So it's the cheapest thing to give anybody. It's very hard for that to crash. It's very hard for that to go wrong. And then when you try and make a modification, minimal work on the server to store that modification away. And then, if you like, a background process to rebuild that HTML file. And a minor detail is that once the TiddlyWiki starts up, it can also monitor the database for subsequent changes. So even if the HTML file that we've saved was cached an hour ago, when we start up, it'll get freshened with the latest data. So my apologies, I have a rather laborious explanation of what's going on there, but I'm really excited about this because By allowing Amazon to do all the hard and complicated things that I'm not interested in, it means that we can explore some really interesting scenarios. So one of them is to be able to essentially replicate TiddlySpace. So TiddlySpace was this idea of TiddlyWiki in the browser, and then in the server we had this idea of multiple bags containing tiddlers, and the idea of a wiki being composed of a series of bags, and we concatenate those tiddlers together to get the tiddlers that should go in the wiki. So one of my goals is to precisely replicate that functionality of TiddlySpace in Amazon. And to be honest, from TiddlyWiki's point of view, that DynamoDB stuff I showed you really doesn't look that different from what the web looks like. So I'm interested in doing that partly, obviously, in order to provide a migration path from TiddlySpace. But also, as we've endlessly discussed, I think, on here, TiddlySpace was kind of an experiment, exploring how we could do multi-user access in TiddlyWiki. And it wasn't a 100% successful. Well, it was a very successful experiment because it wasn't entirely successful. Not everything that we learned affirmed that we were right. Some of the things that we learned were areas where we were wrong. But I'm very keen to put that into action again. It's relevant, I think, for Steve, because Steve's thinking, if I can put it this way, Steve, your thinking around TiddlySpace, around TiddlyWiki and multi-user accesses has, I think, been shaped by the fact you've been a very enthusiastic early adopter of TiddlySpace, and you and your group must be responsible for some substantial chunk of the spaces that have ever been created on TiddlySpace. And so it's partly your experience of TiddlySpace that validates the good parts of the model to me. And of course, the project that I'll now give you should give you a chance to explain, because this massive, no, hang on, I was going to say, but let's say the online course in air quotes that Steve and I have been discussing. One of the characteristics is this idea of people being able to students being able to do work in their own space and then submit it for feedback from tutors in the group. So there's this, and it's a shape that I found cropped up quite a lot when we were talking about TiddlySpace at BT as well, that you could imagine running the same process, for instance, for different projects. Each project has a space, you put information about each project in that space, and then you have some aggregating spaces that pull information about a bunch of projects together and present it together. So it's a pattern that it's almost how you would express the administrator versus user pattern in a conventional app. In a conventional app, you've got access control lists, meaning some people are super powerful, some people don't have superpowers. Here, in a TiddlySpace-like system, everyone has superpowers, but only over their own domain. And what shifts is the fact that my domain, because I'm a student, is visible to Steve, who can reach in and see my work. And I can't reach into my, the other students in the courses areas to see their work. Well, presumably unless they share it with me. So, Steve, would you like to put everybody on the right track about what we're trying to do here?
Yeah. And of course, there's a bit of a solution for. Well, I'm making it for that. Sorry. I don't have a headset. I had to relocate. I apologize. What we ended up doing with TiddlySpace that worked quite well was create. I called them student spaces. Yeah. If I walk away to get a headset, then I will lose my signal. So I'm going to find.
Steve, you should totally go and get your headset, because we're getting a bit of an echo when you talk, and I will happily fill in the gap so that you can leave your laptop behind and it doesn't get disconnected. Oh no, we're getting live action. Live action of Steve getting his headphones. Now, of course, teaching is a theme here, teaching hypertext. Nathan, I'm not sure if that's exactly how you would, the words that you'd use to describe how you were helping your girlfriend make use of TiddlyWiki for building sites, but I'm very curious whether you so Steve, the background here is Nathan, who's on the call, is quite an experienced software developer, the experience of Node.js and so on, has been working on TiddlyWiki for about 18 months. About a year ago, he thrilled us all by showing us some work that his girlfriend had been doing to build a website, I think for a local restaurant. And so what she'd done is created all of the text within TiddlyWiki and then used TiddlyWiki's static HTML exports functionality in order to create the static HTML of the page. And so her thing wasn't that she had some experience of web development, so she was used to being able to crack PHP files. And so slightly curiously, I think what Nathan was focusing on in trying to get her to understand why TiddlyWiki was a help was how a tool at slightly higher level could short circuit some of the things that are conceptually very easy to do if you're just hacking static HTML. And so I think some of that got Nathan expressing in a very interesting way the kind of essence of TiddlyWiki, the things that are distinctive about TiddlyWiki from the perspective of a web developer, where of course you see we're endlessly talking about the perspective, I guess, of a humanities student would be the classic perspective of your student, perhaps, with only some of them having a technical background, as I understand it. Oh, headset's dead. So Steve's charging his headset. Nathan, did you hear all my rambling there?
Yeah, and one thing that we found very helpful, and as I was sort of trying to help her through that, and get her used to working in TiddlyWiki, was setting up little sandbox instances just on a shared drive to share snippets and ideas between. That project's largely been very successful. I think they're up to I want to say 6 or 7 sites now built out through TiddlyWiki and statically deployed. It's been very interesting to watch the others in her organization kind of getting involved with that process. Everybody seems to be really fascinated by TiddlyWiki and want to get in and use it. But it's been really interesting that it's really largely only the non-developers who have sort of taken to it and stuck with it, so to speak. They're largely a Microsoft shop, and when their developer folk kind of get into the mix in it, they're very reluctant to let go of, I want to say Microsoft brainwashing, but that's not a very nice phrase. But to let go of their sort of preconceived notions of web applications and web application development, and that ends up being a very big stumbling block for them because they want it to be .NET, they want it to be that Microsoft thing, and it's very much not. So it's been very fascinating that non-developer users have actually had a much easier time kind of getting involved in that workflow, and they've really taken to it. It's sort of, she has this sort of repeated story where she kind of gives this same demo of they have I think it's 3 sites that share contact and location information about some offices, and the sort of example use case for TiddlyWiki that she always gives to new people coming into it is she shows changing a contact information in a field on a tiddler, and then shows how that change live and dynamically updates all 3 of those sites, all of the contact information for that person on all 3 of those sites at once, sort of automatically and magically, and she pushes the button and it's out there live on the web. And that is something that time and again just blows people away. They're used to working in these heavy-handed CMSs that are very sort of paradigmatic, and where doing something like that, setting up a facility for something like that, is generally a highly complex thing, requires development and lots of code. And for people to see that work just sort of naturally out of the box and in a way that they can, as non-developers, conceptualize and understand, is really something magical. So she's been now sort of, had this sort of shift in her role where she's kind of become the teacher to her organization now, and it's really kind of changed the dynamic of that project in many ways, and it's been very interesting to watch. But yeah, wow. She's been having great success with it, and I think they're about to launch in January another site or two. And I think they're launching their first site that actually has some .NET integration components, and actually is a little more closely coupled to their application. So it'll be very interesting to see how that goes.
That's fascinating. Yeah. It echoes some of the things that my friend Andy, who was on 2 or 3 weeks ago, was talking about. He's a non-technical person working in a organization that has a .NET software development team, and the team's first reaction to TiddlyWiki, I believe, was what's that word I'm looking for? Was that they hated it, and I think kind of you touched on it too. There's something I've found to some software developers that can make them really uncomfortable about TiddlyWiki. Really uncomfortable to the point where they don't just think that they're not interested, but that they think that it shouldn't exist, kind of level.
that it's somehow wrong. Yeah.
Yes. And class. If I can interpret that or put it into words a bit, it's that it's not how the web is supposed to work. That there is a kind of conventional view at the moment that the platonic ideal of the web is static HTML pages with hyperlinks in between them. So there's that sort of view of the web that has nothing to do with software, but then somehow simultaneously there's a software developer's view that the web is a bunch of Unix servers, doing what Unix servers do. And yes. But I've watched. 10 years ago, I used to rant and rail about PHP to anybody that would listen, and I would explain to people, anyway, there was, at the time I was doing work that made it relevant, I hasten to add. The problem was the way that it presented the developer with a very unrealistic model of state management, making it look like state could plausibly follow you around and that you could write, in effect, a stateful web application. And sure enough, by now, 10 years later, it's widely understood that it's highly desirable to write your web application as a stateless application. So I'm happy to wait. You know that one of the ways of talking about TiddlyWiki that's an attempt to try to make it easier for developers is to say, look, the browser, you think it's for displaying web pages. It kind of is, but what it has become is a virtual machine with an interactive user interface. And once you get them to accept that, and that all of the cool and amazing things that the community has figured out in terms of using virtualization over the last 10 years actually apply perfectly to browsers. I provision a new virtual machine with Command T and that sort of thing. So that and of course, there are tools arguably that that sort of point that way. Electron, for instance, combining Chrome and Node.js. But it's weird. There's something. Well, do you remember when Flash, proponents of Flash were challenged by what they saw as Apple's obstinate refusal to embrace Flash? And I was one of the people on the background who saw it as absolutely a case of the law of physics that Adobe had proven that it was impossible to create a bug-free, performant power efficient version of Flash. Therefore, we needed to do something else. I was absolutely not showing any sympathy. But I think we saw something of the same kind of intolerant inability to kind of see a different way of doing things. You know, challenging the fait accompli is not the fait accompli. Sorry, challenging the status quo is an uncomfortable position to be in.
Particularly among software developers who become very set in their ways, almost religious about their tooling.
Yes, and a angry mob with pitchforks. Anyway. But the learning thing, I like the idea that Steve is trying to get largely humanities students up to speed with what's magical about TiddlyWiki. And the thing that I think is interesting about that is they're people that have all experienced Wikipedia. So the things that he's teaching them, if you like, are TiddlyWiki minus Wikipedia, or minus the bits of Wikipedia that you can perceive as a user of Wikipedia, if you see what I mean. So that does mean he's very closely focusing on the distinctive features. And I like the way that your girlfriend's demo was actually, it's kind of a classic MVC demo, isn't it? And so it's taking, I guess it's the same deal, isn't it? That you try and find something that's meaningful, visceral in the person that you're talking to's world, and then try and shine a light on it that way. Interesting challenge. Well, now look, Steve's dropped off without his headset. I'm going to have to drop off a bit earlier than usual, as well as having been late. So I think I've probably got about half an hour, maybe a little bit more to go. Now we've ended up with quite a technical little group. And there was the topic that Mark mentioned earlier on was about refreshing the edit text widget. I wonder if it would be quite fun to just start poking around at that issue and some of the related topics. But before, I mean, perhaps I should ask anything else on the topic that we started with, Steve, learning TiddlyWiki and Amazon and all of that.
One thought that came to mind when you were talking about the Amazon stuff is, I guess the actual thought that came to mind was Amazon gets very expensive. Once you actually start to talk about data scale, they're comparatively expensive at scale. It would be very nice to have those facilities, on a bit of a longer curve, nicely abstracted so that, if I wanted to point my TiddlyWiki in the sky at, say, like an OpenStack Thrift API or remote storage or one of those, that'd be very advantageous to be able to abstract that to multiple different service providers and service provider options, because and a lot of people there, I'm not the only one who's going to have an initial gut reaction of, oh man, Amazon gets so expensive. Now I understand most TiddlyWiki use cases aren't going to reach a scale where that's a major concern, but I can imagine a lot of people having that reaction, having experience with Amazon Web Services in the past. So. Okay,
so a very good point. And so there are some off-the-shelf standards, particularly a thing called remote storage, that is an attempt to create a client-side interface that can talk to a whole bunch of different cloud provider backends. And that's been around for a couple of years, and I've so far resisted the temptation to go and kind of explore it. But it remains, that's a really good expression of your suggestion, because we can interface to that one library and gain. But the trouble is, I think for me, I've come to have a very healthy disregard of abstraction layers that create a new interface and attempt to smooth over the differences between a bunch of other implementations, and all the way back to the 80s when we had GUI frameworks that were trying to do that, were trying to smooth out the difference between different GUIs. I'm kind of come to think that that approach might have an element of a bit of a mirage in it, as in our kind of tidy monkey brains want things in nice little boxes, and you know, there's so to be really specific, Nathan, in terms of I've written against, hard-coded, if you like, against the Amazon APIs. My rationale is partly that we do see a trend of Amazon's APIs being replicated by other providers, and of course OpenStack, as I understand it, is an attempt to kind of industrialize and robustize that. So I'm kind of treating the Amazon APIs as if they were, you know, an open standard, when in fact, of course, they're a de facto standard. But in fact, as de facto standards go, they're not bad because they're all really old. You've probably seen they've versioned their APIs, and all the ones I'm using are like 3 years old. So it's nothing, well, apart from Lambda actually. So it's not too leading edge. But in terms of the switcheroo, what I just showed you, that code was essentially an alternative implementation of the save tiddler command, that instead of saving the tiddler to the local file system, saves it to S3, and an alternative implementation of the render tiddler command that saves, sorry, the other way around actually, that saves it to DynamoDB. And so what I'm thinking is, if nothing else, we've got pluggability at that level, as in we can have a plugin that implements all of these, you know, these same commands against the current backend. So that would mean that the point of standardization would be the user interface that is exposed to the TiddlyWiki user, rather than creating a new abstraction within the code. And the concern there is that there's actually just not that much going on, and so it's quite inserting an abstraction there feels like quite a heavyweight thing. But that's the rough kind of thinking.
Sure, no, that's that's a pretty valid response. I think to that effect, maybe the question becomes more making sure that those sync or saver interfaces stay broad enough and generic enough to be able to support those different sorts of backends and be flexible enough to cover those different cases.
One of the interesting things I've found is that one of the interesting areas I'm just about to hit. So the two features that I described, and I didn't show you them running, but I showed you their effect, they're both implemented as commands. So the sequence is you create an addition or use an addition that includes the AWS plugin, and then those two commands are available. To make Lambda work, what I need is to create a single file of JavaScript that, when executed, will reach out to the correct DynamoDB database to retrieve all of the tiddlers, assemble them together into a file, and then push them to the correct Amazon bucket. So to do that, that means creating a custom version of TiddlyWiki. And we can do that, of course, just with the right template. So one of the thing I'm working on at the moment within the plugin is a template that, when rendered, renders this custom version of TiddlyWiki. So to be, and some of the changes are kind of interesting. So in the background, we've had people complaining about the performance under Node.js. One of the reasons why we have poor performance under Node.js is every time you run TiddlyWiki under Node.js, it assembles the core plugin. It reads all the individual tiddlers of the core plugin. It assembles them into a big JSON blob in a tiddler, i.e. a plugin, and then it unpacks all of that to individual tiddlers. Horrendously inefficient process, but it is done that way so that the second part of the process is the same in the browser and the server, and that consistency is important. But there's an obvious opportunity to cache that under Node.js, so that we don't have to rebuild the core plugin from its constituent tiddlers each time. So the reason I mention that problem is because what I'm doing, one of the side effects of this custom version of TiddlyWiki that I'm creating to run under Amazon Lambda is that it can do that. And another change is that it will never execute JavaScript modules residing in tiddlers. It will only execute JavaScript modules that have been forcibly inserted into the JavaScript that is built. So the purpose, this is quite a big deal. This is to resolve an issue that we've had for a long time. The flexibility of TiddlyWiki, some of it comes from the ability to just throw bits of JavaScript in. That's great in a single user environment, but in a multi-user environment it's dangerous, because if I can write a bit of JavaScript, put it in TiddlyWiki, and then induce you to execute it, I can steal all your credentials or read all your files or what have you. So, and yet the behavior of TiddlyWiki in its current incarnations, it's inherent that if there is a tiddler that is properly marked, as in TiddlyWiki Classic having a system config tag in the new world being marked as a module, then it will be executed. So fixing that takes advantage of a deep, something actually that Nathan, you will remember, that the module mechanism within the TiddlyWiki boot kernel is actually independent of the tiddler mechanism. So although it creates modules from tiddlers, you can create modules directly without them ever having resided in a tiddler. And within the boot kernel, you see a whole bunch of such modules being created. And that's so I'm really interested in that, because that's always been a problem with TiddlyWiki Classic on TiddlySpot, and you know, in some circumstances, it's a crippling, no-go issue. You know, using a system that has inherent security flaws is a challenge in many situations. And so, TiddlyWiki 5 has been designed to try to address that problem. But this is the first time that the tires are hitting the road of actually seeing if we can make it work. Steve, welcome back. Sorry, Nathan. Continue.
You just reminded me in that, touching on the security issues and loading untrusted code in particular. I've been meaning to get in touch with you over this past week. TiddlyDesktop, it seems, I've been playing around with some concepts in TiddlyDesktop and was kind of dismayed to find that I wasn't going to be able to pursue them much further at this juncture because of some security issues. It turns out that the Node WebKit sandboxing is not a very strong sandbox. As things are right now in Node WebKit, there are a couple of mechanisms for escaping that sandbox.
That's the sandbox iframe.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yep.
Wow.
And in particular, I found two ways that I will detail to you offline, sideband. Two ways that a content loaded into a TiddlyWiki in a sandboxed iframe, content loaded into TiddlyDesktop in a sandbox iframe, could escape that sandbox and actually access TiddlyDesktop itself, access of course node modules and such, and access everything really once you escape the sandbox. So I do have, for one of those cases, I do have a workaround fix that TiddlyDesktop could use to avoid that escape. The other is I think going to have to be handled upstream. I found a related open ticket that I'll point you at in the Node WebKit GitHub. They appear to be aware of, at least partially aware of some of these issues, and there's some ongoing discussion there. But definitely something that we should be looking at and thinking about, and thinking about how we, going forward, how we can evaluate and assess sort of the state of Node WebKit and what threat model we're inheriting in TiddlyDesktop from Node WebKit at any given time.
How interesting. Steve, I'll come back to what you posted in the sidebar in a moment. But Nathan, that's fascinating. Over the last round of developments of TiddlyDesktop, I have come to the conclusion that we need to abandon NWJS, Node WebKit, and adopt Electron instead. I'm finding all over the place that there are things that are straightforward and clean in Electron that are either not possible or incredibly lumpy in Node WebKit. And bless them, I think Node WebKit just suffers from being 3 years older now. It's really quite old and pioneering stuff. And I think they've pushed a lot of upstream fixes in their day that Electron has now taken advantage of. And the migration is pretty easy because so many people have gone down the same path. So they've got very, very similar APIs. To your point about the sandbox, as you probably know, Electron exposes the Chromium WebView control that is available to Chromium extensions, and I'm much more confident that the sandboxing there can be properly tested, because obviously it's used in other Chromium deployments, and it's important in other Chromium deployments. So I think what you've just told me is possibly the death knell for NWJS.
Well, that's fine. I think that NWJS largely, like you've said, it's a bit of an aged project now, and I think they've reached sort of a state where they've got too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak.
Yeah, and the fact they've got 2 versions under development, I'm finding really annoying and frustrating, and God knows what it must be like for them. Must be a nightmare.
There's another very recent project that I've kind of had my eye on. It's called Thrust. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's similar in spirit to Node WebKit, although it sort of uniquely wraps the entire WebKit instance and does the sandboxing itself, wraps it in a separate back-end process that is only communicated to over standard I/O. And that I found very interesting, sort of conceptually.
Right,
that's
what they do in Electron as well. So Electron has rigorous, basically there's a process boundary everywhere that there could be a process boundary, and you're obliged to use their quite nice interprocess API to communicate across them. And I think that's one of the mistakes in Node WebKit, is there are some places you've probably seen where you can reach between contexts, and they try and hide the fact that you're reaching between contexts. That was a mistake. That's the kind of thing you need to know when you're writing code, I think. But thank you for Thrust. I shall look at that. I've done some very initial experimentation with Electron, but as I say, at the moment, my Christmas plan is to work on the Amazon stuff. But let me pick up the questions that Steve was asking in the sidebar. So Steve's question was, did I understand correctly that running somebody else's TiddlyWiki, say through Dropbox, opens up security issues via JavaScript, or is that not a problem, or only if running in a TiddlyWeb type situation? And yes, it's the TiddlyWeb situation. So if I can open a TiddlyWiki that you have made, that I can access over HTTP completely safely, and there's no way that opening that in a browser can do any harm. If you give me a file-based TiddlyWiki and I open that, then the situation is slightly different. If you opened it in Firefox and you said OK to the TiddlyFox prompt, then it could do some file access. But otherwise, no. It's the same problem that online services like Facebook solve, and MySpace actually so dismally failed to solve in the old days. So MySpace, when you used to be able to send messages on MySpace, you used to be able to type HTML in the messages. So I could send a message to you that when you opened it, did anything that the JavaScript running in MySpace's page could do, which included, posting ridiculous things as if it was you. And those, in the context of MySpace, it's kind of pranking, I guess, and in the context of TiddlyWiki, it's only as serious as there's the exposure of the data that you've got in your TiddlyWiki. Let us pause to welcome Jed as well. Jed, hiya. Would you like to say hello and introduce yourself if your microphone...
I think my microphone works.
Yes, you are. Okay. Welcome, Jed. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing quite well. Hi, I am Jed. I am previously of the US, now I live in Paris. I am working on a PhD in electrical engineering. I use TiddlyWiki to organize my notes and for many, many other things. I just started a web design job, and on that I am using TiddlyWiki to dynamically create things for making SQL databases, which I actually was very, very happy that worked because it saves me so much time.
Oh, would you like to? We were joking about this at the end of the last hangout. Would you like to show us what you've done?
Oh, I do
Or
not
is
have that
it
here. That's all
probably
on
highly confidential? Is it?
No, actually, it's all for university, and the woman that I'm working for wants to release everything that we do. So actually, hopefully, I'll be able to post this stuff online. It might have to be after the job's over, but.
And so, roughly, is it interact with some user interface stuff in TiddlyWiki, press a button, and get some SQL that I can then squirt into a database, and magic happens?
That is the idea, yes. It's at its very early stages, so right now it just automatically populates the initial things for making all of your tables, using the tiddlers that are in your wiki with nice little tools to add things. But yes, it has saved me hours so far, so I'm very happy with it.
Really awesome. Gosh, so is that it? And it saved you hours because the tasks that you've been given have a large number of have a lot of repetition, or
Yes, there are.
there's a lot of items to be dealt with.
Yes, it is a small school, and they do not have enough tech people, so everything is kind of put together with duct tape and spit. So almost nothing that is supposed to go into the database is in a form that is actually usable in a database. So yeah, like there's lots of PDFs with information that is very important. So, but yes, so pretty much everything that I'm doing is supposed to be made from the ground up, and so I was able to just make tiddlers that have like very simple bits of information about how the tables are set up, and then just create a tiddler, and that adds a column to the table, and then you give the information to it that's tagged, and it gives you all of the information that goes in the tables. And once I have that up and running, then I'll probably use something like Perl to actually make the big chunks of import stuff. But for now, it has saved me lots and lots of time because I can actually put together everything without having to type it all out.
Do you have to produce documentation for anybody else as part of the work?
Yes, actually, that's why I started using TiddlyWiki, and this came out as a unintended consequence or unintended benefit of making documentation in TiddlyWiki. Yeah, I'm only there for 6 months at the longest, and I have to leave this in a form that other people can use. So everything needs to be documented, and it's going quite well so far.
That's really cool. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you could join us, Jed. I was late kicking off, and I'm going to be, annoyingly, I've got to leave slightly early today, maybe 15 minutes or so. Steve, now you're microphoned up, and you've just heard us going down a bit of a rabbit hole about some hardcore tech stuff, but this is all part of a sort of bigger conversation about embracing cloud services, making TiddlyWiki work well for large groups of users, and I guess if I try and thread what Jed said into it, the idea of using TiddlyWiki to create a personal tool that saves you time. I mean, that's the in terms of piquing the interest of your students. There's the intellectual interest that we might be able to stimulate, but in practical terms, if we can show them something that will save them time and trouble in either this or some other endeavor, that sounds like a great success.
I can try my audio again. Am I still getting a lot of echo?
No, you're okay now.
Much better now.
Okay. I didn't do anything different except change location, and I'm having difficulty maintaining this connection, but we'll try. So, not exactly sure that I caught all the conversation, but the discussion about that you were opened up on, and so just some thoughts about that. What I had done in the past with classes in TiddlySpace is I had written a kind of like the professor's version, if you will, the teaching version, and then the students God, it's been so long since Classic included the space, I believe was the language. So they would include my space or the class space, and then they would write their own, and then I would include their spaces back. And I think that there was some in-between loop in there, but essentially what happened was the students could go to one of two spaces, their own, to see my work and theirs, or the class space to see my work and the aggregate. That's pretty much unsatisfactory, but it sort of worked. But now that we've made the move, or I've made the move to TiddlyWiki 5, I'm trying to come up with something in the next 2 weeks or so that's going to work. And the best that I've come up with so far is using Dropbox, where for my critiques of student work, or for the group's critique of each other's work, is they open up somebody else's Dropbox version of a TiddlyWiki, write in it, or make additional tiddlers right on that on the HTTP version, export the tiddlers to their Dropbox, and then in a sense they have to have some notification process where they tell us that there's some critique tiddlers available to be imported. That's pretty also unsatisfactory from a student perspective. But kind of works for me as a professor in that I can critique and I can write on their space, and they can optionally include it or not. And the reason for writing in TiddlyWiki, of course, is that it gives me ability to clone their tiddlers and make suggestions in their code and kind of do all sorts of interesting things. And that's about as close as I've come to something that actually works. And so my sense is that that's what we're going to go with in the spring, unless somebody else has some better ideas for that.
You used the word clone there, I think, did you?
I did, yes. Because I will take somebody's tiddler that I might have suggestions or critiques and clone it so that they can see their code and my code, and I'm not changing their code. And then when they include it or import it, when they import the tiddler back into their space, it's got obviously a different name.
It makes me think of something that's been crossing my mind recently. We talk sometimes about smallest federated wiki, which is a companion project. It's a fellow traveler to TiddlyWiki. And smallest federated wiki is always focused on the federation part of the problem. And there's a guy whose Twitter handle is Holden, who for some time has been a very interesting member of the smallest federated wiki community. He writes. And so he writes about the project and has been involved, I think, for quite a long time. And something that he's just started doing is he's taking a furlough, would that be the word, from smallest federated wiki in order to implement some of smallest federated wiki's essential qualities in WordPress. So it's a really interesting idea. Here's a guy who's steeped in the same stuff as roughly the smallest federated wiki world, so to say, is very similar, but with this focus on federation, and now trying to take that essence to WordPress. So in a sense, from a TiddlyWiki perspective, WordPress is already kind of so far away from some of our core concepts. I can't really conceive of what it would mean to take the essence of TiddlyWiki and transliterate it into WordPress. I'm not sure. I could imagine hosting TiddlyWiki within WordPress, but it's not clear to me that I could reconcile those, the two models of the world. But from what I've read of Holden's book, because he's focusing on the idea of forking, that's actually not such a difficult problem. So the model becomes I see somebody else's federated WordPress post, I fork it, takes a copy on my site, and I make modifications if I wish, and I use trackbacks and so on to notify the original author. So it looks like quite it's a really interesting project. WordPress, huge audience. I'm fascinated to see what that enormous audience makes of this very interesting capability. What was I trying to say? That the thing that provokes my thought the most about the whole thing is the use of the word fork, because we all understand. I mean, in terms of computer software, forking has become a very powerful, resonant concept. You know, it's the way, it's the word that sort of epitomizes this idea of frictionless, permissionless innovation, because I fork your code without your permission, I improve it, and if my improvements are worthwhile, then you'll fold the changes back. But here's my question after that long introduction. And I noticed that you're using clone. So clone and fork, they clearly refer to slightly different stages, because forking, to me, the word means both making a copy and preparing to modify it. So there's something inherent about the intent to modify that is inherent to me when I hear forking. And I think that's probably just cultural, because I came across forking in an environment where you didn't need to fork unless you were going to make modifications. Quite an important point. You know, cloning seems like it's just, you know, the first part of that. I'm going to collect my own copy of this, and I'm really curious which of those words, if any, resonates with users, because they're both, you know, like hypertext, they're both neologisms that we've created. And so, my goodness, if we're going to create words and burden our users with, a word that doesn't have its everyday meaning, we better make sure that the neologisms we phrase, you know, give us the most coverage, if you see what I mean. And so I've been playing around thinking about one of the interesting things I like about cloning, you know, that very first part of the forking process, if I can put it that way, is that it makes a copy of the resource. So actually, for people of my age, I first browsed the web in 1993, and so therefore, my perspective is that the problem with the web is that it melts like snow, and I think that's a really big deal. It's a really big deal that in my personal writing or sort of personal learning objectives, what have you, I can barely refer to websites. There's very few websites that I've found relevant in the late 90s that are still there that I can still link to. So actually, I think cloning is a really powerful, important concept. This idea of preserving content so that I have a copy that I can rely on regardless of what happens anywhere else, whatever anybody else does. That actually, I think, is quite a primal need on not just my part, but on all of our parts. And I guess when I start thinking technically about what that means, then I also want to be notified of changes to a text that I have cloned, which obviously is implied in the idea of forking, I think. But again, forking, it seems to emphasize all the wrong bits. So I wonder about the word subscribe. The idea of I'm going to subscribe to this thing, and that has the idea of getting the updates. I know it's not quite right. And collect is a word that in previous, slightly different contexts, but previous explorations, we've arrived at collect as being the sort of a word that I think taps into collecting, again, is quite a deep, instinctive bit of human behavior. Nathan's just pointing out on the sidebar that a fork would track. Yes. You mean rather than being a fork of the old version, yeah. But Steve, you're waving your arms around because this is, I'd love to know what you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I was using the word clone to very specifically mean to clone a tiddler. And so it's a little thing when you got the little tool that says clone. And so I, again, come to it from a very user perspective. And so a clone is simply making a copy of a single tiddler within a space, within a wiki. With I think it's got a number 1 or 2 or something added to the title. My understanding of fork, the places that I see that is that's saying something like GitHub, where you copy an entire wiki and then prepare to move on with changes, but you don't change the underlying names. To me, the important thing about the clone is that you've changed the name.
So you change when you fork, you change the name because the fork moves it to a new place. and the name includes the place in it. Say again?
You move the whole wiki. You don't fork a tiddler. Because of
no, so it's an imperfect analogy, but I think so in GitHub you have to fork the entire repo, but that fork might only be a modification to a single tiddler. So I mean, the mechanism is pretty close. It's I mean, it is a question of whether the wording works. But you see, I think the verb, we know about, we went through some of your material, Steve, about writing. And so we've got the beginning of this progression of the verbs of the things that people do. They read them, they knit them together into sequences, and they write them. That's the 3 data points on the progression of sort of increasing levels of involvement. And somewhere in there, we need to fit all of these operations: preserving a copy, and tracking changes to that copy, modifying the copy, feeding the changes back to the other person. So, yeah, forking is so interesting because it's the right kind of neologism that does, in the technical context, kind of cover the entire process, but it doesn't really give you a good feeling for the effect of it. But I suppose Steve's saying I think it might be more semantic in terms of function. Clone is tiddler level, fork is wiki level. I could see cloning a wiki as well. I don't have a strong feelings on the difference between two words. Okay, I'm only interested in the tiddler cloning. So I think cloning a wiki is just, let's just assume that a wiki can be represented as a tiddler. That's a useful thing to be able to do, and so we can clone wikis. But cloning tiddlers seems to be the operation that has some mapping into our cognitive space, and that's what we're after, is the verb that describes not the mechanical thing that we do with the user interface, but the kind of process, or maybe the judgment that we've gone through in order to submit this thing to this process or verb, whatever it is. So, and just for clarity, collect, we've had collect, fork, clone, copy, subscribe, and none of those are good enough, I think, is where we are. And annoyingly, one really frustrating thing is, if tiddler was a better word, we'd be able to, tiddler itself would suggest them. So there's been some interest in the past in using the word shoal, because shoal's a great word for a whole bunch of tiddlers. But it kind of makes sense. But there aren't very many verbs. Tiddlers don't do anything. There's no verbs that automatically apply.
And so the idea, I mean, to me, cloning and forking probably doesn't matter much in terms of the differences in the words. I think forking is going to mean something more to programmer types, and cloning is going to have somewhat more resonance among ordinary users. They fundamentally understand what a clone is. It's an exact replica. I think most people get that. Fork is the fork is the point in the road where the clone was made.
So what might an ordinary person call a modified clone? Because it's no longer a replica, so it's no longer a clone.
Exactly, right. So it's a changed clone, and that's the cloning is a process, and it's the same with forking. That's an interesting conundrum. But yeah, I'll have to think about, and I'll give some thought to the word fork and clone. Although I've chosen to use them the way that they're already defined in various platforms like GitHub and TiddlyWiki.
Yeah, Nathan's saying in the sidebar, fork implies an ability to merge or rejoin. And you're absolutely right, I'd forgotten that. Thinking about railroad tracks, the whole point of the fork is they're coming back together. And so, I could maybe buy that is such an important characteristic that a verb that leaves room for that might be good. But guys, now as promised, I do need to push off. But before I do, I'd like to welcome Eric, who's snuck in during the last discussion. Eric, good morning to you at 9:46 on the West Coast.
It is. I'm sorry I was unable to attend the earlier portion of the conference because I had to take my car in for service this morning and drop it off early at the beginning of the day. So
that must have been ridiculously early, Eric. I'm sorry to hear that.
it was early for me, yes, indeed. Anyway, I'll do the usual thing. I'm Eric Schulman, author of Tiddly Tools, administrator of the Google Groups, and TiddlyWiki consultant, and eventually the author of Inside TiddlyWiki, The Missing Manuals.
Oh gosh, and we got Mario as well. Mario, hi.
Hi.
We just paused to welcome Eric. Would you like to say hello and introduce yourself as well?
Hi, yeah. My name is Mario. I wanted to do the annotations from Austria, near Salzburg, contributed to TiddlyWiki Classic and TiddlyWiki 5, and doing the annotations. And now I wanted to start to do the these annotations. So, but you're still live. So okay, hello.
Hello, Mario. So yes, Mario is the person who I know for a fact has sat through all 200 hours of Hangouts. Well, I suppose I've sat through all the Hangouts as well, actually, now I come to think about it. No, you've sat through them twice in many cases, Mario.
Yeah.
I've got to push off, I'm afraid. Before I do, we don't have, or I have not yet scheduled the date of the next Hangout, but I'm thinking we'll probably do one on Monday or Tuesday of next week, and I'll try and book that as soon as I can, and that'll probably be the last one until the new year. We'll kick off again early January. Before I buzz off, any final thoughts or comments from anybody on any of the stuff we've been discussing, or indeed anything else, and suggestions for what parts of this discussion we might pick up and continue in a future Hangout, also very welcome.
I'd be glad to sort of do a little bit of a prep work and generate a bit of an issues list, if that's of interest to others, just to talk about how ordinary folks might experiment with using TiddlyWiki in a learning environment. So if that's of interest, I'll be glad to sort of prepare something and have a list of...
Well, awesome. I mean, to be clear, I'll try to book the same slot next Monday. So okay. If that works for you, then great, and I'll confirm that in the next day or two. Mario sent a link.
Yeah, I found this today. It looks interesting. You should have a look at it. So
yes, I think I may have come across this. NOQ, hot stuff.
Yeah. It's about self-contained systems, which TiddlyWiki actually is. So
that's very nice, and it's once again, it's a the site would make an awesome TiddlyWiki.
Yeah. I thought about this too. Yeah.
Great. Well, as I say, my apologies for having to go so early and for being late, but I'm quite pleased that at least now we're keeping quite a decent rhythm to the Hangouts. I think we've been back at basically a Hangout a week for 8 weeks or something, I think. Steve's saying he's going to share the Dropbox version of TiddlyWiki by the end of this week. Do you mean THWT, Steve?
Yes, I do.
Excellent. So this is what Steve showed last week. I've seen it as well. It's Steve's text over the top of the TiddlyWiki.com text. Yeah, really interesting. I think that'll be very popular if you can get that out the door. And Eric, from one of the consequences of your last appearance on a Hangout was yet more pressure to publish the infrastructure that you've created for your Inside TiddlyWiki, TiddlyWiki, if you see what I mean. Gosh, how often does the word TiddlyWiki occur twice in a sentence?
many times in this conversation. But I'd like to report that what I have done in the past week is to take my document, which had all the book content and everything, and first started to strip out the content, and discovered a couple of bugs when there's no content, because apparently it creates some infinite recursion when there's lists. So some debugging to be done there. And that led me to the other part of the process, which is each of the pieces that I've developed for this document, I'm taking them separately into an empty document and making sure that they have minimal dependencies on each other, so that once I put this out there, people will be able to mix and match the parts of it, and without having to unthread everything.
Yeah.
So I'm doing that
without having the monolithic
right
Tiddly tools problem.
Well,
Right.
it's sort of
Well,
like suddenly I'm discovering that I've used my CSS classes a little too widely, and I can sort of have all things dependent upon some central definitions that I'd rather not have them.
I would, I'm sure that I wouldn't be the only one to suggest that once you've done this work, when you're prepared to offer it around, you should maybe pass the hat around a little. I'm sure there are many people in the community who would like to make their appreciation known, at least enough, for it at Christmas time to be noticeable. But you should, maybe you should consider that.
Yeah,
it's a year ago since most people made their last contribution to the Indiegogo appeal.
Yeah.
Anyway, I really must go. So I'm going to say, before I do, thank you very much to everybody who came today. Much appreciate it. Mark, it started out as the Mark and Jeremy show, and we have subsequently been joined by everybody else. And of course, in the process, we didn't get to talk about the stuff that you and I started out with, but we'll pick it up in the future. And of course, I would encourage you to. There are some topics on GitHub about it. Do feel free to bounce them up to the top, and get my attention back on those. But guys, thank you very much for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. Thank you for making time to be here. Thank you everybody for contributing to the discussion, making it so interesting. I shall look forward to seeing everybody at the Hangout, so hopefully this time next week. But in the meantime, bye-bye everybody. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.